Before we dive in, can you share a little bit about yourself?
Myself, yeah, I am a 69-year-old father of three, one on the other side, 40 years sober, which gave me an opening to God and eventually the metaphysical. My daughter's married and works for me. My son is working in the automotive business in Colorado. My wife's a therapist and a healer and a wonderful individual. June 29th, we'll be married 35 years. Had an amazing run. The only hiccup, and it was a pretty big one, was in 16. Our son was in a tragic canoe accident with three other boys and went to heaven.
Can you describe yourself when you first found Andrew, what you were feeling, what you were going through?
Yeah, absolutely. Had been exposed to the metaphysical about 12 years before when I went and saw a medium. Francine Myers was her name, and she was in the Chicago suburbs, not far from where Andrew lives now. And stayed in touch a little bit, and wasn't a very eventful reading, but there wasn't anything pressing really. But at the end, she did say, "Your dad's here, and he's holding a caboose and telling you railroad." And if you look over my shoulder, there's a railroad lantern. My dad spent 40 years on the railroad. We had five boys. We all worked on the railroad. We were a railroad family. And that message came very clear. And what it meant was that my dad is someplace that I can connect to. And that was the message. No lottery numbers, no secrets to success. But I walked away with that with and that's something. And filed it away. And 12 years later, when driving up to Wisconsin, when I'm told my son was missing, and driving up assuming I'm going to find him in a boathouse with a pretty co-ed, halfway up I got a phone call that said it's no longer a search but a recovery. All four boys had drowned. And at that point, what came to me was that if my dad is somewhere that I was accessible to those 12 years ago, then he's with my son. He's looking out for my son. We were a very clannish family, and we looked out for each other. And I remember thinking, and you're a little bit in shock with that kind of news. I remember thinking, it's my job to figure out how to do this, how to find them, and that was my job, and that was how I undertook this. And I thought, and if this is all metaphysical BS, I'll just cross it off the list and find another way to heal my soul. But the deeper I got, the closer I got, the more I started believing into the other side. I had decided that this medium friend, and I had called her on the phone, and we had talked right after Christopher transitioned, and I got some amazing info that I wouldn't confirm until I got the coroner's report, but she was spot on. But that was on the phone, and I started believing in mediums or the right medium, and I wanted to be able to look in the face of a medium who was looking at my son. So I went online, and unbeknownst to me, there was a book that I had read that I loved called Bob Olson, Evidence of the Afterlife. And he had mentioned, he had his own chart of mediums. And I went online and looked up the chart, and there was one that was not too far from us, and it was Andrew. And he'd worked for local police departments, and he had quite a story of his own. So I thought I'd book a healing or a reading with Andrew, and give just my first name. I'm a big fan of having outs. I always need an out. Where's the back door? How soon can I hit that before anybody notices? The Irish goodbye. So I had just given him my name. I hadn't paid yet. So I figured if the closer I got, if I got nervous or changed my mind or felt this wasn't for me, I could cancel. Now, the day before that meeting, I'll tell you that Christopher was drowned January 3rd, 2016. This was June 30th, 2016. So this is just 6 months after, and this is the first medium visit I had other than the two phone calls I had with Francine, who, by the way, I've connected with, who's in Surprise, Arizona, and had lunch with, and I adore her, and she's friends. But, I want to be able to sit down with a medium and be in person. So the day before that meeting, I'll tell you that Christopher was drowned January 3rd, 2016. This was June 30th, 2016. So this is just 6 months after, and this is the first medium visit I had other than the two phone calls I had with Francine, who, by the way, I've connected with, who's in Surprise, Arizona, and had lunch with, and I adore her, and she's friends. But, I want to be able to sit down with a medium and be in person. So the day before, I ordered a couple things. And one of the things was I wanted shamrock seeds for the grave. Now, let me explain the grave a little bit to you. Is that we bought 3 graves in Sacred Heart Cemetery, 3 plots. And we did it in January in the snow. And the woman from the funeral parlor, who wasn't happy about getting out of her Lexus in a fur coat, said, which one do you want? And I thought, well, the one on the end for Chris would be nice. It's near this tree. We could decorate the tree a little bit, isn't that ducky? And so we said, fine, let's do that one. So Chris was interred there January 8th. And as the snow started to melt, it was apparent that he was buried next to another couple, even though there was our 2 blanks to the left of him. And I was infuriated. It looked like he was their kid. I have my issues, and one of them is family, and that one was nobody's kid but mine. And so actually, after arm wrestling and a little poo-pooing here and there, and I wrote a check, and we moved him to the middle plot that would have. And I'll occupy his plot, and Sally will occupy the other one. So Sally and I will be on the outside of our baby boy, our firstborn. They did. They interred him, and of course the ground was now loose in June, end of June. So I had taken these shamrock seeds before I went to see Andrew and sprinkled them around the grave. To this day, in the spring, you'll see shamrocks pop up around the grave, and which is pretty nice. It's 10 years later. And another thing I pulled this leather bracelet out. When Chris was about 4, maybe 5, we were at Disney World, and he had his mom buy me that bracelet to give me, and it said Dad on it, and it had the character Goofy on it. I don't know if that was an indication of things to come with me, but and I wore it that weekend and took it off and put it in my dresser. Well, that morning I put it on and stopped at the grave and planted my seeds, and then headed over to see Andrew. And when I got to see Andrew, I came in, and he had asked for some pictures of Chris, which I had brought with me. And most of the pictures were pictures of him in a party setting with fun, on a cruise, whatever. Chicago Blackhawks championship polo shirt, smiling with his arm around a friend. Those are the pictures I sent. And so when I got in to see Andrew, it was the first time I met him. I'm a little cautious, a tad nervous, very calming guy. And went into his office, and he asked for the pictures. And he said, these pictures are all of Chris of having fun. And there were moments he had more fun than a barrel of monkeys. But he also had a dark side, and he wasn't sure he belonged in this world. And his mom and I wrestled with that, knew that he suffered from depression, and knew that he used drugs and alcohol to self-medicate, and had addiction issues that runs in the family. And so there was always part of that in the shadows that always concerned us. And then Andrew looked at me and he said, what did your family on the other side? They all came together, and there's a huge mass of them. What did they celebrate the night before? And it took me a while to think. And I said, well, it was going to be Sally and my 25th anniversary. And so it was the day before it was the 25th anniversary. And of course we didn't celebrate it. You're not going to celebrate an anniversary when you're 6 months into losing your oldest child. He said, you didn't, but they did, along with your son. And he said, let me ask you, he said, Chris says that you sprinkled something around his grave this morning, something with seeds. And he said, and Chris is acknowledging you're wearing his bracelet. Now, nobody knew about the seeds. I wasn't hiding my seed situation. They just came in from Amazon the night before. I got up early and headed to the grave and planted. And I would have, if they came in, I would have taken credit for them with my wife. And otherwise, it was just something I did personally between me and Chris. And the bracelet is kind of like under here, how these bracelets are under my cuff. And so none of this was any foreknowledge, and that was the moment. I believed in mediums. I believed in the other side. I believed in connecting. But that moment with the seeds and the bracelet, I switched over to knowing. And Andrew, being an evidentiary medium, did exactly that. He provided evidence to me that he was talking to my son. Called me Pop, which Chris called me. The number of intimate things that Chris and I shared about moments together, in the desert, moments together, at ball games. It's not on Facebook and it's not on YouTube. This was all very fresh, and there was no knowledge of this other than a college boy and his friends drowned in Wisconsin.
You described, Andrew mentioned that Chris's personality would come out during the readings, his humor and everything. Can you describe how that felt knowing that Chris still kept who he was even on the other side?
Yeah, it's really clear to me after Andrew would talk. Andrew would say, Chris is behind you, and he's got his hands like this on top of your head. And he would make fun of my crew cut, Chris would, but he was joyful and he made fun and sensitive, and all of that would come through Andrew. I mean, Andrew couldn't have been able to describe the boy that he described because he didn't know him unless he was connecting and feeling and touching with him and connecting. So, that is other reasons that I knew. And it's funny, hold on, close this just a little bit. That it's funny that spirits I have found, because I've been doing this 10 years now, Bella, have their favorite mediums. He loves Andrew. He loves Sherry Jewell. There was another very famous medium that wanted to do a reading. She came out with a world-renowned book. And Chris barely came through. It's because he didn't like her. I don't think he just wasn't taken by her. I think it's, we don't lose our personalities over there. Chris has told me one time we were involved in a session, and I'll explain that in a second. The subject came up of space-time continuation. And he said, you're not going to get it, Pop. You're not that smart. Wait till you cross over, then you'll understand. But he's still funny, really charming, very, very considerate, loving. He speaks of my sister who crossed over a few years later in 16, and I'm told they're together all the time. He speaks lovingly of her. So he's very much, I would say, the boy that comes through was the best of Chris on this side. He doesn't suffer from addiction. He doesn't have any insecurities. There's no anxiety. There's no depression. It's him, and it's him learning. He told me he learned how to surf over there. He's told me he learned to speak French. He's learning to be his best self in soul. And I'm sure that'll suit him well when he returns back to Earth School.
You described that working with Andrew and connecting with Chris changed your grief, and you are no longer afraid of death. Can you describe that a little?
Sure. So let's not confuse grief and sadness. I'm still in grief, and I still have moments every day, Bella, of sadness. But I have this amazing life, far beyond what I deserved, far beyond. I was a wild kid, bit of a jagoff, and yet I had a spiritual awakening, and the compulsion to drink lifted when I was 28 years old, and had been a member of AA since. I think even though 13 years of Catholic school before that, I learned more about God, in that foray. And so I had a God base, but it was far from open. It just wasn't. It just wasn't open. So I had believed in God, and when I walked into the rooms, I felt that whatever term you want to put on it, most mediums adhere to the principles of a loving higher power and believe that's where our souls go. That's where we are. I think Andrew, describing the other side and things that Chris said to me, literally telling me that he'll be there when I cross, has eliminated any fear that I've ever had about crossing over. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not ready to go. I'm on my third book. I've written two. My first one's my first Search for Christopher on the Other Side. My second one is We're Not Done Yet, Pop, My Lessons from the Other Side. And the third one, which should be out next year, is called One Foot in Both Worlds. And it's funny, Andrew and I were having a session a couple weeks back, and he said, it's a trilogy. I think you're done after that. And I was pretty comfortable with that. So Andrew has laid a path for me. Andrew's been very helpful with meditation. Andrew's been very helpful in how to learn to align my chakras and meditate. And those are huge keys when you want to meet with your loved ones on the other side in meditation. You need to connect your chakras. You need to, all of the things, the sage, I've got a crew cut and kind of a bent nose, and I'm kind of a regular guy, yet I adhere to the principles of an entire calling on a different side, and it's about kindness and service. I often wondered why, with my reckless youth, I was able to survive, why God kept me out of the foray, why I was able to, wake up from these ridiculous situations in one piece. And it wasn't to be, maybe to be a father, because I was a pretty good one. I am a pretty good one. And a husband, pretty good one. But it had to be more than that. And one time Sally was listening to Rebecca Rosen quote she was quoting the principles, and she said, I'd heard her over her speaker of her phone that said, you have one great purpose, and you have only one great purpose, and that's the one that God gave you. And she was quoting from the Course in Miracles. And I thought, that's it. That's it. I have one purpose that God gave me, and that's to help other parents who've lost kids, who think it's over, who think it's the only thing they have is the yearbook, the baby book. And the truth of the matter is that spirit is right there. Andrew taught me that. Andrew brought those spirits into me, made me know how to unlock those secrets, to connect with them. Chris and I still connect a couple times a month, 3 times, 3 a.m. here in this office that used to be his bedroom, and we still connect. And it's amazing. I journal it and I put it in the books, and there'll be a bunch that'll be left over after I'm gone, and somebody will figure out what to do with it. But I have one of those feelings that even though they're pretty impactful here, I'm literally carrying the water for Chris, and there's a lot of stories about suicide, family, friendships, connections, mediums. They're phenomenal books, and I can say that with all humility because I'm just following the breadcrumbs. But I think there'll be a bunch of writings, and I think those books, when I'm gone, probably better if it keeps my ego intact, that when I'm gone, they're going to make a big impact on people that need them, need to hear them. And I think, God and the angels will make sure that gets to the right people. To this day, I get calls. Yesterday, called. Somebody said a couple years ago, I was at a book signing. A friend of mine lost their son, and they're just having a horrible time 6 months ago. I know it's an inconvenience. I said, just stop right there. Wherever, whenever. You want to sit outside? You want to meet first? You want me to meet with them? You want to meet together? I don't care. Let's just put it together, because it's important. I need to carry that message that Chris has. The one that Susan Geisman, the brilliant author and ex-military, she was a military Navy commander and medium, wrote that, they're still here. Your loved ones are still here. Hook up with a guy like Andrew, or Andrew. I've given Andrew's name to a lot of people, and nobody's come away and said, that was a swing and a miss. He's got a gift. He knows how to connect with the ones you need to connect with.
For parents who maybe are scared to start this process or scared of disappointment, what would you say to
Great question. First of all, go see a guy like Andrew. Helping Parents Heal is it's a wonderful group that I use, and I'm part of that. And I'm a contributor and fortunate enough to speak at the international conference. I got a feeling somebody must have backed out, and they went to the bullpen and pulled me out. But I was honored to be around these magnificent authors and speakers. So do a little work on your own. And if you try this and it doesn't work, we'll refund all your misery. We'll refund your loneliness. Because what you need to know is that you're not alone. Groups like Helping Parents Heal let you feel it. It's all on Zoom. It makes you feel that you're not alone. Because you're not. I thought I was the only guy in the world who suffered this loss. And after a long story with a friend of mine, and it's actually this story's going to the 3rd book that I had met, a guy named Matt, and he told me about losing his 2 4-year-olds. So as I go into Sacred Heart to visit Chris, I'll stop off at Emmett and Sean's grave and say hello to them for their dad. So I'm not the only guy that has this grief, But I will say that if you expect it to go away, you're going to be disappointed. We're going to acquire tools to handle the grief, tools like visiting mediums, meditation. But anybody who said time heals all wounds never lost a child. Pain's always going to be there. And sometimes it's crippling, and sometimes it's just a little pounding, but it's always there. And my advice to you is let it take you over and let it go roll like a tsunami and go back out to sea. You'll be beat up, but you'll still be there. Don't fight it. And it gets different. I'll never be whole until Chris and I meet again on the other side. As far as the fear of disappointment, guys, nothing's more disappointing than thinking you'll never see your child again and then it's over. Take a shot. I'm not a frivolous guy. I'm not a woo-woo type guy. I took a shot and it changed the course of my life. And I feel, other than the piece of my heart missing for Chris, I feel whole because God gave me this purpose. So I promise you, your children, your loved ones are there, and they're knocking on the window for you to go like, dude, do your part. Will you meet with a medium now and then that maybe isn't a great reading? Sure. Will you go to a good restaurant sometimes and maybe have an average meal? Sure. But you find the ones that work for you and you keep going back.
Can you describe Andrew's gifts in your own words?
Yeah. Andrew's a different cat. I just love him. Let me tell you, I've never had a medium connect so well with somebody. I have another medium friend who has a really nice relationship with Chris, but their relationship is personal, which I just love. I went one time we were gonna have some barbecue pork chops and au gratin potatoes, which is one of our favorite meals, before a session, and I was late. It was raining. The restaurant didn't have the food ready. While I was still on time en route, I get a text from Andrew who said, Chris tells me you're going to be late. So Chris is great. One of my favorite stories is Andrew's running on a treadmill, and he's in pretty good shape. Running on a treadmill, and Chris appears next to him running on air. And Chris said, I got a poem for you to write down for my dad. Chris and Andrew said, Chris, I'm on a treadmill. Can you come back later? And Chris was very persistent. That was just him. Since he was a tiny kid, it was like, he's going to wear you down. And Chris said, no, now it's good. So Andrew, on his headset, turns off the music, calls his daughter and said, will you transcribe this poem that the Spirit's given me for his dad? So, this is kind of, you got to laugh. When he said to me, something strange happened. I was pulling out of my parking lot in the city, heading back to Winnetka, and I put the car in park and moved in, because when a guy who talks to the dead tells you something weird happened, put the car in park, So Chris gave me this wonderful poem. We had written a song called, my buddy's a brilliant musician, and we went into the studios, and I'm not bad at writing, and we wrote a song called I'll Send You Feathers, and he's got a poem called I'll Send You Feathers. How do you make that stuff up? That stuff just doesn't happen, And, so his gift is that he can connect with spirit amazingly. And he's got this wonderful kind of abrupt, calm, loving feeling about him. There is no BS in Andrew. And that's what I mean abrupt, not in a rude way. Meaning what's there is there. He came up at one of my book signings, first one I believe. Christopher's old girlfriend, who, God bless her, she's married now, just had a baby. We love her. She helped bring the best out of my boy, and she was there. And Andrew had never met her, and she happened to be sitting next to me. Andrew looked at her and said, "You must be somebody really important to Chris, because at all these events, Chris is always standing next to his dad, but he's right next to you." And she was a huge part of his life, So. Andrew didn't do that to display his gifts. Andrew's just being Andrew, dude. Same way some people can throw a 95-mile-an-hour fastball, and other people can cook up a amazing meal. Andrew connects with spirits on the other side, and in my case, made a dear friend of my son.